Throughout history, Ukrainians have demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of enormous challenges. Despite numerous attempts to destroy and assimilate them, Ukrainians have managed to preserve their identity and are proud to be a nation. In this video, I will explore the ideas of Ukrainian thinkers on the question, what makes Ukrainians a nation? According to the Ukrainian philosopher Evgen Bystritsky, the concept of national identity refers to the belonging of people to their community and implies the identity of qualities, namely virtues, that are inherent in the manifestations of the life of this community throughout historical changes. Identifying commonalities in the worldviews of people over extended periods of time can be challenging. For instance, the inhabitants of Ukrainian lands during the Cossack era and in the 21st century show noticeably different characteristics. Nevertheless, we can identify some common traits in their mindset and behavior. The foremost among these is a high value placed on freedom. This has been exemplified by both the Cossack uprisings and contemporary Ukraine's defense of its territory against Russian aggression. Another historical event that clearly demonstrates the values of the Ukrainian nation is the referendum for the restoration of Ukraine's independence in 1991. 91% voted for independence, choosing freedom for their country and a life separate from Russia. This vote was also a rejection of Ukraine's Soviet past. Ukrainians voted for democracy, human rights, and a European future for their nation. This choice for independence was not only a decision for the country's sovereignty, but also a decision for individual freedom, opposing the Soviet authoritarianism and state violence over individual rights. Ukrainians were not content with the rigid power structure that existed in the Soviet era. Ukrainian thinker Miroslav Marinovich argues that horizontal connections are more natural in Ukrainian society than vertical connections. And Ukrainian researcher Mikhailo Vinnytsky states that Ukrainians tend to favor heterarchy over hierarchy in political power. Russia's war against Ukraine has once again presented Ukrainians with a choice to fight for their freedom or to succumb to Russian domination and authoritarianism. Despite facing an enemy that is vastly superior in strength, Ukrainians have demonstrated an unwavering commitment to fighting for their freedom, even if it means putting their lives on the line. The pursuit of freedom is a critical aspect of what defines the Ukrainian nation, but it is not the only factor that shapes its unique identity. According to the Ukrainian philosopher Oksana Zabushko, culture is the objectification of the national existence of a people. She emphasizes that each culture creates its own immanent, more or less closed symbolic system. The culture of Ukraine is ancient and well-developed, encompassing values, traditions, language, historical experiences and achievements that define the Ukrainian nation. At the beginning of the 1990s, Oksana Zabushko made a distinction between speechless cultures and speaking cultures. She argues that the former do not practice self-awareness and can only be described by other cultures, while the latter, speaking cultures such as Ukrainian culture, practice self-awareness and are capable of introspection. Zabushka asserts that Ukrainians have a long history of self-awareness as a nation, and she places a particular emphasis on her concept of приtomність of the nation. The Ukrainian word приtomність has two meanings. First, it refers to the consciousness of a subject remaining in general mental adequacy with the outside world. Second, it signifies presence and witnessing. Both meanings are significant when discussing the Ukrainian national identity. According to Zabushka, a nation can be considered culturally приtomна when its culture is not only integral and dynamic but also permeated by the light of reflection on the changing reality of history. For a nation, history is the only reality. The ability of Ukrainians to practice self-awareness and reflection on their history and cultural heritage makes them a приtomна nation. The act of a nation reflecting on its own essence is a philosophical activity that stems from the ancient maxim, know thyself. Zabushka states that only its own philosophy makes a national culture spoken, articulate, and approachable to understanding both in time for future generations through a memory fixed in words and in space for other cultures. At the same time, it is irrelevant in what form the national philosophy will be carried out, whether it will be multi-volume treatises following the classic German model or the ingeniously laconic title that Paul Gauguin wrote under one of his paintings. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? That reflection must be expressed, put into words, and recorded in language. On Ukrainian lands, writers and poets were the first to ponder the question of what the Ukrainian nation is. According to Zabushka, since the late 18th century, the Ukrainian national cultural revival has followed the model of Romanticism, where language itself, along with verbal creativity and writing as the primary ethno-differentiating features, assumed a centralizing and system-organizing function in the culture. Zabushka argues that the philosophy of national idea refers to all forms of philosophical reflection on the national idea, from the academic purism of logical conceptual discourse to marginal popularizing genres of essays and journalism and even fiction. In other words, it encompasses all types of verbal culture in which national self-consciousness asks itself questions about the meaning of life, questions that affect not only intellect but the whole human being and are essential for the existence of national community. Zabushka also knows that the key to understanding why every national idea tends to flow into the practical political sphere lies in the primordial human question, who am I? Or in relation to the community, who are we? This inevitably leads to the question, what do I have to do? Throughout centuries, opponents of the Ukrainian nation have attempted to deprive its people of consciousness by distorting their true history. Oksana Zabushka writes that the totalitarian state spiritual practice consisted of the conscious and purposeful aspiration to make Ukrainian culture unconscious by completely alienating it from historical reality. However, all these attempts turned out to be in vain. Ukrainians were able to resist them in the past and Ukrainians continue to assert their right to be themselves every day. Community identity, according to Evgen Bystritsky, is characterized by the care for self-preservation, the fear of losing identity, and the determination to defend oneself. In times of danger, these factors help unite the nation. Bystritsky argues that the readiness of the immune system of the identity to defend its live world requires a real objectification of the danger. First of all, it requires a threat from the other. The Russian government has been explicit in its desire to deprive Ukrainians of their statehood, freedom of choice, respect for human rights and democracy. They openly express their intention to assimilate Ukrainians into a single Russian people. Putin had hoped that Ukrainians would comply with these wishes, but they are deeply attached to their identity and will not give it up. Even the brutal and powerful invasion of Russian troops failed to overcome the desire of Ukrainians to be free. Despite the tremendous trials of the ongoing war, Ukrainians continue to fight for their right to be themselves. National freedom and identity are of great importance to Ukrainians. Bystritsky explains that caring for one's own identity is a way of being in one's cultural world, and it decisively forms the original existential structure of human experience, whether rationally realized in the form of, for instance, patriotism or not. In this sense, the fear of losing one's identity is associated with the dread of losing one's essential authenticity. In the early 2010s, Mykola Repchuk, a Ukrainian researcher, suggested that Ukrainian identity consists of two sub-identities. Ethnocultural Ukrainian sub-identity, which is oriented towards the West, and another Ukrainian sub-identity, which maintains ties to the Soviet past. According to Repchuk, independence prompted former inhabitants of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic to re-identify themselves politically with the state of Ukraine. However, cultural re-identification turned out to be optional. The distinct cultural symbols and priorities of these two sub-identities have led to some differences between them. Putin hoped to exploit these differences to entice Ukrainians with post-Soviet sub-identity to his side, but his shelling and killing of civilians only served to unite the country. As Repchuk noted, the Russian aggression became a serious challenge to the unity of the Ukrainian nation, but it also provided an opportunity for national consolidation based on the protection of common values and the stock of solidarity and mutual trust accumulated during the joint resistance. Ukraine is a large country with diverse regions, but all Ukrainians felt a strong sense of unity when, on the morning of 24th February 2022, Russian missiles struck all regions of the country: east, west, south, north, and center of Ukraine. Later that same day, thousands of people from across the country came forward as volunteers to defend their homeland. Ukraine remains politically, socially, and ethnically diverse, but as Miroslav Marinovich points out, the country is now united in its thinking. According to him, Ukrainians have been praying for decades to be united, for the country from Lviv to Luhansk to be pro-Ukrainian, and to act in support of Ukraine. Today we have such unity, an incredible unity in Ukraine, and we all think alike. More precisely, we think differently but in unison. This is a very important clarification, as it allows us to maintain our mosaic identity. We are different depending on the region, but we think in unison. We share a common goal to achieve victory for Ukraine. There are different concepts of what constitutes a nation. Ukrainian thinker Yaroslav Grytsak outlines two of them, the ethnic and political concepts. The roots of the ethnic concept can be traced back to ancient Greek policies in which the right of blood determined citizenship, and only those born to citizens of the polis could themselves be citizens. On the other hand, the political model is based on the concept of loyalty to the laws of the state and the ideals of its people, with ancient Rome serving as the archetype of this model. Yaroslav Grytsak argues that when Ukraine gained its independence in 1881, the Ukrainian people chose the political model of a nation. He points to the referendum held on 1st December 1991, in which an overwhelming majority of voters approved the Declaration of Independence. Grytsak emphasizes that the percentage of those who voted for Ukrainian independence, which was 91%, surpassed the 65% of Ukrainophone citizens of Ukraine and 73% of ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine. This indicates that not only ethnic Ukrainians or Ukrainophone people decided to become citizens of independent Ukraine, but also all those who live on its territory chose to embrace its laws and ideals. In 1991, the residents of the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic voted for Ukraine's independence from Russia and for a European future built on the values of freedom, democracy, and respect for human rights. Today, Ukrainians of different ethnicities and political views are fighting side by side with weapons in their hands to defend these same values against Russian aggression. While not all members of the Ukrainian nation are ethnic Ukrainians, they share a common respect for Ukrainian culture, value freedom, and hold vision that the future of Ukraine should be independent, democratic, and aligned with the free nations of the West. Having a shared vision of the main features of its future is essential for any nation. Yevhen Bystritsky criticizes the notion of national identity as merely a description of what exists in the present. He argues that identity has two vectors: a centripetal vector that helps people return to their own values and meanings to protect their way of life, and a projective vector that creates opportunities to go beyond existing experience. According to Bystritsky, identity is both being and the possibility of being something other than the fixed reality, relying as much as possible on the essential features of the community's life, yet not fully coinciding with its material stability. As a nation, we Ukrainians share a common vision of our future and are committed to building it together. Ukrainians are going through a difficult time right now, but we feel and know what kind of future we want, and we will build it step by step.